Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you and you can hear me. Great.
Are we live now? No.
We are, yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So yeah, we're just waiting for more people to come in. I can see that the numbers are going up. I'll probably get a rush and it gets to past. Okay, it's past now, but I think the numbers are still going up a bit. So we'll just give it a couple more minutes. Okay, so I'll start off now. I might get some more people coming in. I've got a bit to get through in the introduction. So hello everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Museums+Tech 2020. I'm Sarah Middle. I'm the MCG Secretary and the Programme Chair for Museums+Tech 2020. And I'm also a PhD researcher in digital humanities at the Open University. I hope those of you who attended yesterday enjoyed the presentations that were given by our brilliant speakers, as well as our various networking options, and that you went away inspired by all the amazing initiatives involving cultural heritage and digital technologies in crisis situations. Before we start today, I've got a few reminders about housekeeping. So talks will be captioned live by our partners Stage Text and My Clear Text. The link to the captions is pinned in the chat. We recommend that you open the caption stream in a separate window that you can view alongside the presentations. Just to let you know also for the breakout sessions today, we're not going to be captioning the breakout sessions by default, but if you would benefit from live captions and you're attending a breakout session, please do let Sarah Cole know. She might be able to sort that out for you. The networking space you can find in the left-hand menu is going to be open during the break. What this does is it randomly matches you with another attendee. You have a 3-minute sort of speed networking session. Other options are the virtual queue for coffee, which you can find in the sessions tab. That's just a text chat. Or you can browse through the list of attendees in the people tab, and you can either send direct messages or invite them to a video chat. Please tweet about the conference using the hashtag Museums+Tech2020 and follow us at UKMCG. While interacting with others at the conference or on social media, please remember that this is a safe space and abide by our code of conduct at all times. So if Sarah or Daph could post that in the chat, that would be great. If you do need to report someone for inappropriate behaviour, you can do this by finding their profile in the People tab and clicking the 3 dots in the top right-hand corner, or if you send Sarah Cole a direct message. Please also contact Sarah if you have any technical issues with the Hop-in platform. We had some really great contributions in the chat during yesterday's session, so thank you to everyone for contributing. If you've got any questions or comments during the talks, please post them in the chat for that session under the session tab. The chair will collate them to ask during the Q&A. And then throughout today, please also keep an eye on the event-wide tab, because that's what we'll use for any announcements that we need to make. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers today with presentation sessions on themes of inclusion and education and transformations. And there's also a chance to take part in themed breakout groups on specific topics, which is a new format that we've introduced for the virtual conference this year. But first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Sharon Heal. Sharon is the director of the Museums Association, a campaigning membership body that promotes the value of museums to society. She regularly comments on museums and cultural policy in the UK, speaks at conferences and events in the UK and internationally, and has published extensively. She lectures in the history of museums, museum ethics, and museums and social impact. Sharon is also the chair of the Museum of Homelessness and a member of the European Museum Forum. Sharon's talk today is titled Brave New World, Thinking about the Future of Museums. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm just going to hopefully share the presentation. Great, so that should all be up and running. This is a new platform for me, but I think we're all learning in this brave new world, new platforms and new ways of interacting with each other. And thank you very much to Museum Computer Group for asking me to speak and present today. I did catch some of the conference yesterday, and there seems to be some really lively conversations about the contribution we can all make to the future of museums, and some really deep thought and engagement on this topic. So I think we're at a break point for museums. Now that's easy to say, but what does it actually mean? So I looked it up, I looked in a dictionary, or I looked it up online, more to the point. And as a noun, it means a convenient point at which to make a change or an interruption. But interestingly, or maybe interestingly for some of the people in today's audience, in software development terms, it means a breakpoint means an intentional stopping or pausing place in a program put in place for debugging purposes. So if we say we're at a break point for museums, does that mean we have to debug museums for the future? It is difficult to see silver linings and opportunities when the outlook is potentially quite bleak, when no sooner than we were all reopening museums and we had to close them down again. And now many are in a position of awaiting a review of tiers to see whether it's possible to reopen museums before Christmas, and who knows what the new year will hold. But one positive is that some of us have had time to pause and reassess and reflect, and to do the things that really a lot of us have done in our families, as individuals and in society, to think about what truly matters. And I think that's what we need to do in the sector, think about what matters for our museums and our communities. Now, I hesitate to draw analogies with the wartime period. To be honest, if on most evenings we're in our PJs watching Netflix or chilling with our families, then it's not a wartime period. But I was pointed in the direction of a book by Mark O'Neill. He's not the author of the book, he pointed me to the book. Some of you will know Mark O'Neill. He was the leader of Glasgow Museums, and he's now the chair of judges for the European Museum of the Year Awards. And he pointed me to Museums and the Second World War, Curators, Culture and Change by Catherine Pearson. And it's an interesting read because it's the only other point in living history when most museums were closed in the UK. And I was really struck by this quote by Dr. F.S. Wallace, the director of Bristol City Museum and the honorary editor of Museums Journal, which of course we still publish today, where he says, in the midst of the darkness and brutality of war, museums and art galleries have seized all the available opportunities for spreading the light of learning and culture. Their amazing development during the past 20 years has been tremendously accelerated, not retarded, as was first anticipated by war conditions. And the image there on screen is of bomb damage at the Imperial War Museum. So that's a really interesting thing to consider, isn't it? That at a time of war, when some museums transferred their collections out of their buildings for safekeeping and safe storage, the lens of the museum worker turned from internal and from the collection to external and to community. So there was that real feeling that far from shutting up shop, many museums, in regional museums in particular, became creative and cultural hubs for their communities. And I think it is really important that we understand the history of our own sector. Again, I was struck by a tweet from Museum Space Invaders, which is a feminist network in the sector that I'm a member of. And it related to a blog from the East End Women's Museum, which was talking about Kate Hall, the first known woman museum curator in England. And she began her work in the East End of London. And not only did she represent a breakthrough for women gaining employment in the sector, but she also helped launch museum education, in particular in the impoverished East End of London. And she had a real focus on community engagement and learning in those poorer areas of the capital. And again, an inspirational story that I think we should all know about and reflect on in terms of the history of our sector. The innovation that we take forward now is based on the traditions of some of our forebears in museums. I think the question for us now is, can we use this opportunity to rethink what a museum is and what the purpose of a museum is in society? So rather than coming up with lots of answers, I'm going to ask lots of questions, and I think that's what we should be doing. Are we asking ourselves, what have we learned from the last 9 months? Are we asking ourselves, why are we here? Who do we serve? And what is our purpose? And those are some of the questions that we've asked ourselves as the Museums Association. We've been around for a long time as a Museums Association, but as for everybody else, this pandemic was new to us and represented challenges. And the thing that we did, which I think many of you will have done with the institutions that you work with, is go back to our mission, vision and values. So our mission is inspiring museums to change lives. Our vision is for inclusive and participatory and sustainable museums at the heart of their communities. And our values centre on inclusivity, diversity and equality. And it's really important to go back to those core foundations to check if they're still right, if they serve purpose, and to use them to guide our work in an emergency and in a challenging situation. It mattered for us because it meant we were able to focus on 4 priorities as a result of that going back to our mission, vision and values. And our priorities that we set as an organisation were staff welfare, business continuity, supporting our members and supporting the wider sector. And I think what matters at the heart of that, and I think what has become evident as a result of this pandemic and other events that have happened this year. And what will inform our future thinking is the idea that people make museums, that people are at the heart and the centre of what we do. And that's everyone, that's front of house, back of house, that's subject specialists and generalists, it's our volunteers, our trustees, everyone who works in and with museums, but also our communities and the public, the people who can visit, those that don't visit. It's all of that constituency that make museums, and they are the important, critical linchpin of our future. So every organisation should have gone through that reviewing of mission, vision and values at the beginning of this crisis, and that should provide the lens for the future of our institutions. We know that we've all had to take and face tough decisions, and there will be more to come. And understanding our purpose and understanding why we're here is what will get us through it. As I said, COVID-19 is not the only thing that we've had to face this year. Our view of the world has been shaken and stirred by the Black Lives Matter movement, and continues to resonate through society, as we've seen just this week with the protests and the counter-protests at football matches. And for museums, I think we have to tackle some of those big issues that the movement raises. Where does racism come from in society? How do museums contribute to that? And what can we do to support anti-racism? And you know, are we asking, again, those critical questions? What conversations are we having to ensure that racism is taken seriously and that we're seen to be fighting for equality? And I think it's important because when Black Lives Matter and other movements around equality come to the fore, they look to the built heritage, the civic environment, and to museums and their collections for answers. And I don't think we can be found wanting. If we are found wanting, we will be irrelevant to those communities that are fighting for equality. The UK had one of the biggest empires that the world has ever seen, and that has left scars that ripple through history and ripple through society and families and communities, and they break to the surface when movements such as this take place. And a lot of the history and legacy of empire is held within our buildings and collections in museums. I thought it was interesting that in Bristol, for example, these two images are from Bristol, when Edward Colston's statue ended up coming down and was toppled, it ended up in a museum collection, in the museum collection in Bristol. And what's significant then is the conversation that takes place after that with communities led by the Mayor of Bristol to have an open and transparent conversation about what next on the plinth, and what next in the interpretation of that statue and the collections and the civic environment in that city. And I know that's happened in many other cities throughout the UK. So you can see how one movement then ripples and has impacts across the whole of the UK, and in particular into our museums. And we can't be abstract from those conversations. And actually, I think it's really interesting that museums have been centred in many of those conversations about what next in terms of interpretation and deepening and democratising the narratives in our institutions. There are other issues too. The issue of climate crisis has not gone away. David Attenborough just within the last month has launched a campaign against to raise awareness of species extinction. A number of nature charities came together in the UK to talk about the depletion of species and nature in the UK, and that campaign was informed by the knowledge in our collections, the natural history collections that many of our institutions hold. And I think it's critical, because of not just the collections, but because of the place that museums hold in civic society, that we act practically and with our communities to make change as institutions, but also to ensure that the focus doesn't go away from the climate crisis, I think museums are uniquely positioned to have that conversation at a local and regional level and use our collections and spaces to make change. One of our value systems in the sector is our code of ethics, and I've never referred to it as much as I have in the past year. COVID-19 raises many ethical questions, as do the Black Lives Matter movement and the climate crisis. And I think the code is critical in supporting how we think and behave in this crisis, but also how we use it to shape how we think and behave in the future. So we've had that issue around the toppling of statues and decolonisation, and we have live cases coming before our ethics committee around those issues. In England, we faced the issue of ministerial interference in arm's length bodies by the minister. And again, it's easy to go back to the code. 1.2 of the code clearly states, ensure editorial integrity in programming and interpretation, and resist attempts to influence interpretation or content by particular interest groups, including lenders, donors and funders. So it provides a baseline of values and guidance for how we act and behave. Undoubtedly, disposal by sale will come to the fore more, and there are active cases being referred to the ethics committee in that area because of the financial pressure that many museums find themselves under. So the code of ethics can not only be a practical guide to our day-to-day behaviour, but can help us think about the future as well. The reason that we put public benefit as a number one principle for the code of ethics was because we very, very much wanted to censor people at the heart of that code. One of the first things that we did when the pandemic hit, when we thought about how the code of ethics could support our work, was issue some support and guidance around contemporary collecting. Of course, many people who work in museums' first instinct when there is change in society is to think we need to collect. And that's absolutely right. We need to collect what's happening in this period as a record for the future. But I think thinking about it from an ethical point of view and through an ethical lens means that we collect with communities, not for or on behalf of communities. So we collect with them, and we collect the stories attached to the objects and the ephemera that comes into our institutions. And I think that's the critical difference that thinking about it in an ethical way can bring to our practice. What we do now will help shape our future, and museums are already responding, as we know, to these big issues. I was struck when I walked through Edinburgh city centre in between the two lockdowns that when all the city museums were still closed, that there was a trail called United We Stand, and many of these plaques that you can see here in this slide were outside closed museum venues. So the museums and the staff in museums in Edinburgh could have said, we can't do anything, our venues are closed, you know, we're doing our online offer, but there's nothing we can do in the physical spaces or in the physical realm. Instead, they worked with other cultural organisations, with writers and artists and poets to create this trail through the city centre, through and past some of their venues to raise consciousness and awareness about Black Lives Matter and the issues that it raises around equality and anti-racism. And I thought that was a brilliant response when it would have been easy to do nothing. And also we've seen how many of our institutions have responded to the issues of the legacy of empire and slavery in our collections. I really love and support the example of the National Trust's Colonial Countryside project, where based on rigorous research, based on really thorough and rigorous research, they looked at a group of historic houses and their link between the British Empire and slavery and the collections and the built environment, and works with, which I think is the stroke of genius, school children to reinterpret those stories and to tell the untold stories within their collections. And obviously have faced a backlash for doing that. You know, there's probably not a week goes past that either the Daily Mail or the Telegraph has an article condemning the work of the National Trust. And I think we should support our colleagues who work in those institutions where they're trying to deepen and broaden the interpretation and to tell new and untold stories. We at the Museums Association are supporting a working group to provide decolonisation guidance so that more of us can do this work. And again, I think this is part of the work that we need to broaden in the future. And restitution and repatriation are part of that conversation. And some museums are already doing this work. This slide shows an image from Manchester Museum, and Manchester Museum returned 43 sacred items to Indigenous Australians just before the pandemic at the beginning of this year. And they've really been at the forefront of thinking about how we work with source communities, how we work with diaspora communities, and how we can share collections in a meaningful way and return them if that is the right thing to do. And again, I think that open dialogue and conversation is part of the music of the future of our sector. And museums have been active and involved in the campaign against the climate crisis. So when we had those strikes, this seems like a lifetime ago, and it was only last year, when we had the climate strikes, this image is from, on the left, the steps of the National Museum where the climate strikers gathered for their protests. And I thought it was brilliant to see the way in which museum staff then responded by bringing out their collections and inviting the strikers into the institution at the National Museum in Cardiff in order to have dialogue and discussion and debate about how the collections could be used and how the strikers could reinterpret the spaces and the collections to show the impact of the climate crisis, which I know is an ongoing relationship that has been built as a result of those protests on the steps of the museums. So we are making changes in how we work, and I think what we have to do is remember what went before the pandemic, all the brilliant work that we were doing to include our communities, to work and build and develop relationships, and some of the fantastic work that's happened during the pandemic to ensure that that shapes the future and that it's not forgotten. You will know as well as I do, and Zach referenced it yesterday, that at the beginning of the pandemic there was that rush to get everything on the line and online, and there was real innovation and a real burgeoning of different digital offers for the sector, from the sector, with our communities, for our communities. But it also, as many people have mentioned, exposed that digital divide. And that's not going to go away once this pandemic is over and once the vaccine takes hold and there's a return to something that is more familiar in terms of ways of working. That digital divide will still be there. So how do we ensure that we're working with our communities to make sure that all of our offer, online and in real life, is available for everyone? It would be easy to think that the future is bleak, that no sooner are we sort of subsumed by the tidal wave of COVID, then on the back of that we know there will be hard financial times for us, for our communities and for our institutions. And then obviously we've got climate change, and I would add to these three tidal waves the inequality and systemic racism. So they could all engulf us and we could be overwhelmed. So I think we should use this opportunity to think, not just be sure to wash your hands and all will be well, but to think, what can we do to support a sustainable future for our institutions and also to support our communities? And again, I would say go back to our values. For us, Museums Change Lives is our flagship campaign. And it's not just the work that's taken place in lockdown over the past 10 months that's been transformational, it's the work that went before that as well. And it's simple themes that museums can enhance health and well-being, create better places for us to live and work, and inspire engagement, debate and reflection, I think matter now more than they ever did. It was launched in 2014, but I think it has absolute resonance now, and it's influenced everything we've done and lots that museums have done since it was launched. So for us, from a policy point of view, it influenced empowering collections, our collections report, it influenced our work on decolonisation, and it influenced the publication of our learning and engagement manifesto just very recently. One of the things I think museums can do is provide hope for the future. It has been a really crap year. It's been really difficult. It's been difficult personally. It's been difficult for our communities. It's been difficult for our families. It's been difficult for our institutions. But what we need to do is give ourselves hope and give our communities hope. And I think there's several ways in which museums can do this. In between the two lockdowns, I went to the Refugees exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London, and it's absolutely fantastic and transformational. It has an amazing collection of objects, of stories, of personal testimony, of audio visuals, of interactive and immersive experiences. And I thought when I was there and when I left that exhibition, only in a museum could you have that experience. I also managed to get to St Fagans during the break between the lockdowns and the tier systems. And I was there on a beautiful late summer day. And as I was walking through the landscape, I talked to front of house staff and to staff that were in the grounds, and they were so happy to be back in that space and so happy to have their visitors back in that space at that time. And I thought, again, you know, that's a moment of hope that we can provide for our communities when we welcome them back into our spaces and into our landscapes. Hope can also come from our persistence to open our institutions and to have people back, to persist in welcoming our communities and offering our collections online when our institutions are closed, and in real life when our institutions are able to open. And hope can also come from what we do in the face of an emergency. Many of you may have seen what the Museum of Homelessness did in the first lockdown. I'm a trustee of the Museum of Homelessness, but I was so impressed by the volunteers and what they did to transform their offer in order to be able to provide hot food for people on the streets of Islington and in temporary accommodation, to also campaign for change in government policy, and to also work with people with lived experience to collect the stories and experience of homeless people during a lockdown. So hope can come from a variety of areas in our museums, and I think that's what we offer. I would say, I think we need to be active. I think we need to be activists. We need to activate our museums. And I'll finish just with one slide, which came into the public realm yesterday, which I think is the music of the future for museums, and is the hope that we can provide, and is the absolute demonstration of how museums can change lives. And that's what they've done at the Thackeray Medical Museum, where they've now transformed part of their space to become a COVID-19 vaccination hub. I think that is the music of the future for our museums.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was brilliant. That was so inspiring, and I think a lot of what you said really resonated with our audience. Looking at some of the comments that we've had in the chat and on Twitter. So we've had support to the National Trust from Sarah Cole. Zach Mensah, so Zach was one of our keynotes yesterday, posted a reminder that for people of colour, this year has been exhausting in regards to all things internal, public and media to do with being a person of colour. So something really important to bear in mind. We've also had a comment from Becky Morris to say, it's important that any comms or outreach have alternative formats, including digital, to fully engage with audiences and attracting customers to museums and heritage. I don't know if you want to respond to either of those comments, Sharon.
Yes, and thank you, Becky. That is a really important reminder, actually, that it's not just a digital divide in terms of who has access to internet and platforms. It's a divide in terms of whether there is accessibility of what we put out into on our digital platforms. So it's really useful to have Becky and organisations that she works with as that reminder, as well as providing resources and expertise in order to be able to push museums and challenge museums to make sure all of their material, whether it's in person or online, is accessible. And I think the point that Zach raises is a really, really important one. The enormous emotional labour that people of colour have had to do during the pandemic, where we know that some sections of the population have suffered disproportionately, but also as a result of the issues raised by Black Lives Matter. And it shouldn't always be the responsibility of our colleagues who are people of colour to take on those big issues. Everybody should be taking on those issues and standing in solidarity with those organisations that are under attack when they, only seek to broaden our understanding and to deepen our understanding of the UK's history and how that's centred in our collections.
Thank you. We've also had a comment earlier on, a question earlier on from Rebecca Sinker about the government roundtable in response to the Museums Association response to Oliver Dowden's letter. What was the outcome of that? That's taken place.
I think the roundtable was postponed. It was due to take place after our conference in November, and it was postponed, and it has been reconvened. And I would hope that the government would listen to what people in museums are saying with the expertise that we hold, not just about collections, but also about our communities, and would look at our code of ethics, which is endorsed and by the whole of the sector, which makes us really important points about editorial integrity and independence. And we're not saying we know best in museums, but what we're saying is we will communicate with and consult our communities, as they have done, for example, at the Museum of the Home, the Jeffrey Museum in London, about the collections, about the statue of Jeffrey that is on the front of the building, and that they will do that in an open and transparent and democratic way, and they will listen to the voice of their communities and participants, and that's exactly what should happen. So I would hope that the government would then listen to museums and their communities and allow them to make the decisions about reinterpretation and to make the decisions about how we interpret and deepen and broaden those narratives.
Thank you. That really relates well to something that people have been posting on Twitter as well. We've had several comments about your statement of collecting with communities, not on behalf of them. I think that's really resonated with people, and I think that's something that people have taken away from your talk as being a really important message. We've had another comment in the chat from Scott Billings, that the triple wave cartoon of COVID, recession and climate change was really powerful, increasing severity in each wave, and of course inequality hugely at play in all of them. Did you want to say anything more about that, the inequality?
Yeah, and I think Scott's right there, because these are not issues that stand alone and just impact every member of society equally. They're all interlinked, they all interact with each other, and they do impact different communities and members of the public disproportionately. So we've seen that with COVID in terms of impact on different segments of the community. We know that climate crisis globally impacts some communities more than it does others. And we know that the recession will impact some communities more than it does others. There's already, you know, a growing north-south divide in the UK, in England anyway, in terms of the impact of the recession and the impact of the slowing down of the economy, and that will impact families and young people growing up in poverty. That was a report, a headline that was out this week from the Joseph Rowntree Trust, that there's been an increase in children growing up in poverty as a result of the pandemic, and that is disproportionately impacting those families in the north of England. So absolutely, I think we need to be alive to that as museums and as people who work in and with museums, so that we understand the impact, but we can also work with and support communities to overcome that impact. And I think it's not about us being the experts in doing that, it's about working with those organisations, charities and third sector organisations and community organisations that do have the expertise. And what we can offer is brilliant collections that can help people explore different solutions and different ways of thinking, and also spaces hopefully in the future into which those communities can come and share ideas, can share collective, you know, family time, community time. And I think all of that is important.
Great, thank you. We've had a comment from Chris Cullen. Sorry about that. Sorry, that was my phone. Oh, really sorry. We had a comment from Chris Cullen saying, thank you very much for the keynote. We need to include a discussion around the truth and censorship, and understanding that we also need to meet disinformation head on. And a response to that from Jane Showell, agree with Chris Cullen, disinformation is something that museums could be looking to address this and be a big part in tackling this issue. So do you have anything more to say about the idea of museums kind of tackling the disinformation?
Yeah, I think we have a really, really important role to play in that. So museums are still seen as trusted spaces above many other institutions in society. And I think we need to use that trust which is placed in us by our communities and the public really carefully. And that would be, for me, about creating spaces for debate and reflection, and not a monolithic, you know, view or set of opinions or ideas. You can have a clash of ideas and opinions, you can have debate and discussion, but you can also sift through that for some of the disinformation. So, you know, like the anti-vax campaigns, etc. You know, and that's why I'm so proud that the Thackeray is a vaccine hub in Leeds, because I think to put that in a museum space that is already trusted, to put that in that space, I think welcomes people into a trusted space where they feel that not only are they placing their trust in the NHS and medical professionals, but in the museum aligning itself to that, I think gives it an added impact. And I think it's, you know, not every museum can be a vaccine hub, but museums can have conversations about anti-vax and how safe vaccines are, about big pharma, and about all the associated issues. So absolutely overcoming the sort of misinformation, disinformation is part of our role.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Claudia Strange. Claudia says, really great talk, thank you. Do you have any advice for museum staff who might have been furloughed for a very long time and want to bring all of this back to work with them when they return?
Oh, that's a great question, Claudia. And, you know, I'm really aware that furlough and redeployment and being the staff that are left behind in the museum all has had an impact on how we work and on our, you know, on us personally during this period. And we furloughed staff, and we're on a rolling programme of furloughs at the Museums Association. I think in terms of how we take this work forward, I was at a really interesting talk at Share Museums conference a couple of weeks ago, and somebody who worked for a local authority museum reflected on the role of redeployment. So staff in local authority museums, as we know, some of them have been redeployed to frontline services. And she said it was the best thing that could have happened to some of the museum staff, and including herself, and to the museum, because it raised the profile of the museum across the local authority, because there was lots of different departments working together in frontline services. And also it meant that they could link up future partnerships for the museum with social services and with other groups that were being redeployed in the front line. So I know not everybody can do that, but what I would say is volunteering and supporting local charities, if you have the time and the capacity to do it as part of furlough, would be a fantastic thing to do. You know, I'm a trustee of the Museum of Homelessness, and I volunteered every week during the first lockdown when we were doing the food drops to temporary accommodation in the street, and it was transformative for me. You know, I volunteered for that trustee as a charity as a trustee, but being there as a volunteer with other volunteers, you know, doing that work made a huge difference to my understanding of homelessness, of the issues, of lived experience, of the work of the charity. So I would say, and I know it's not always easy or possible to volunteer, but to reach out to some of those organisations on the front line, because that will then really serve you going back into the museum, because it will give you the links, the understanding, the potential for collaboration with other organisations and individuals. But also look after yourself on furlough. Self-care is really important. You know, I know that people who work in museums are really passionate about working in museums and are really driven and work incredibly hard. So look after yourself, do some of that, you know, reading about the history of museums. It's really important to understand our history and where we've come from. And so, yeah, look after yourself, read, volunteer.
Thank you. And then just one final comment, which I thought would be a really nice one to end on. This is from Alec Ward. Thought the point about asking ourselves what we've learned from the last 9 months is a really important one. For many, there might be the temptation to focus on the fact that the organisation has survived, rather than focusing on or celebrating why they have survived and for who. So do you have some final remarks to respond to Alec before we close?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point, Alec, because the other reflection from that book about the Second World War and museums that the author Catherine Pearson makes is that despite the gains that were made in learning and engagement and the civic role and the creative and cultural hub role of museums during the Second World War, once the mainly male curatorial gaze returned into those institutions, some of that work retrenched and some of the gains were not held. So we absolutely do need to think, if we've started working in different ways, then we can't go back to what we were before. We need to take those gains and we need to absolutely celebrate them. Alec is right. And we need to think about the focus that we need to have working with our communities. So everybody's talking about the digital divide. We can't just go back to in real life experiences and forget that still there is a digital divide in society and that many of our communities won't be able to access our online offer. So we know all of the stuff that we know about inequality and racism. We can't go back to thinking that's an issue that doesn't affect us. But I'm pretty confident, actually, because we've had such a high level of debate and discussion in the sector, not just at this conference, but many others, that we won't slip back. But it's within all of our power to ensure that we don't allow that slippage and just think, well, thank God my museum's still standing and I've still got a job, but think actually what's happening outside this institution. We've opened our doors, our collections here, our interpretation, our learning and engagement offer, but what is happening outside of the walls of the institution? And I think that will be the biggest learning point we could take into the future.
It's great. Thank you so much, Sharon. It's been a brilliant opening to today, given everyone a lot to think about. And I think it's probably a great lead-in as well to our next session, which is on inclusion and education. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you all over in the inclusion and education session shortly. Bye.